Hello, everyone. We're back again with another episode of The Fact, the series that discusses international issues every week. Today, we're going to talk about this new change that happened in Britain, and we witnessed that Boris Johnson came to power as another prime minister of the country. We're going to talk about the outcomes and effects of such a change in Britain and also in different countries. We have two respected guests tonight. We have Mr. Barry Grossman. He's an analyst and also a political activist from Indonesia. And also we have Mr. Ali Musawi. He's a journalist and political analyst from Lebanon. I would like to welcome both of you on the program. It's a true honor to have you on this episode. I would like to start with the first question, which is basically something that happened a while ago, and Theresa May resigned from her position, and that actually was something that was surprising to many people. Barry, can you explain a bit about the reason behind that and also the atmosphere that actually caused such a change in Britain's administration?
Well, look, I take the view that it was surprising that she didn't resign a whole lot earlier. In fact, there were countless rebellions against her in the party, and probably the most appropriate thing to say is that in addition to making a mess of a whole lot of different issues, she was unable to do her job, which was namely to negotiate a Brexit deal and get Brexit across the line. In fact, if one was cynical, one could take the view that Cameron resigned and room was made for her to take the prime ministership to essentially put the UK on a holding pattern until we got to the point where we're at now. But what was quite clear was that she was entirely unable to advance the issue any further than she had. There's certainly elements in the party that were completely unwilling to accept the deal that she had, after all of this time, negotiated with the EU, and in particular the Irish backstop. It was surprising, in fact, that she didn't go down in a vote of no confidence, but anyway, she resigned. I would suggest she was probably pushed out. There was nowhere else for her to go. And so now, of course, we have Boris, and I guess we'll spend a bit of time now speaking about Boris. But I, for one, am more than happy to see the backside of Theresa May. And if we're lucky, we'll never hear from her again.
Okay. Well, actually, you mentioned something concerning EU, and that is something that basically considered as one of the most important issues of the administration of England. So after Theresa May, we have the option of Boris Johnson, which was chosen somehow to be the prime minister. But considering all of these issues, like Brexit, like the different problems that England has concerning the war in the Middle East and problems in the Middle East, do you think Boris Johnson can be a good option or reasonable option to be the Prime Minister of the England or not? Ali, can you explain a bit about this point?
Well, having Boris Johnson, having Britain in the Middle East is never positive ever since they actually got into the Middle East. So it doesn't make a difference which Prime Minister is ruling Britain because it's always been, they've all created a mess in this region. From the Balfour Declaration up until now, we've had Sykes-Picot, the division of the Middle East. We've had the multiple wars that Britain was at the forefront of them, including the invasion of Iraq and the attempt to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And now the latest is the tension in Syria. So it doesn't really matter what the Prime Minister in Britain is. The same will always be done, that Britain will be a source of chaos in this region. Now, as for Boris Johnson, if he's the best option, I think looking at it from the Tories' perspective, he was the poster boy of Brexit during the referendum, and having Theresa May as the Prime Minister of the past few years showed that she couldn't really get Brexit going. She couldn't negotiate with the EU strong enough, or that's the way she appeared, that she didn't seem to be strong enough to negotiate with the EU or to affirm the country's position. Now, the people voted for Brexit, regardless of who voted for what, the people voted for that, and as a Prime Minister, that's what they wanted. They wanted a Prime Minister who could follow through with that referendum. But Theresa May failed, and now we have Boris Johnson, who was the poster boy of Brexit, and he's going to try, and he was voted in by the Brexiteers of his party. So it will be interesting to see how that poster boy if he could actually become the diplomat they're hoping he will be. We've seen him as the foreign secretary, and he wasn't exactly good for the job. He was actually sacked by Theresa May. And now he's the Prime Minister trying to push for Brexit. I don't know how they see it as a good move. The man has been his chaos wherever he went. During the Brexit referendum, he blatantly lied to the public about what Brexit would mean to the people of Britain, and now he has the power to make these changes. Now, how it will be done, it's unclear. How the EU will respond to some of his antics, which we have come to expect of him. It's still unclear what he will do, and we're not expecting a smooth transition out of Brexit during his tenure as Prime Minister.
Well, Ali has mentioned that this chaotic, so-called chaotic, Prime Minister would bring lots of problems to the future of the England. But if we go into details, Barry, can you tell us about more details if we talk about his approach toward Brexit? First of all, what will be his specific approach toward Brexit, and would it change something in a good way, or it will just, like Ali said, it will make chaos?
Well, look, before I address, I just would like to say one thing about what is commonly assumed, and really quite accurate in many ways, which is that the British public voted for Brexit. But what I would say is, in fact, that they didn't vote for Brexit because they had no idea what Brexit was. And it was a very strange move by David Cameron to throw this out for a referendum without actually ensuring that the public was informed, and indeed the government was informed about Brexit, about what Brexit would entail. It's almost like they were driving the nation over a cliff. And let's not forget, of course, that a weak EU, which of course is what the EU is minus the UK, means an even stronger United States, and therein lies the problem. So we have these elements in the UK beholding to international bankers and foreign interests and special interests and the corporate sector, basically backing Brexit, even though they personally are hedging their bets and moving out of the country, taking their assets offshore, and recognize the chaos and economic catastrophe that will ensue. And so we now have Boris to oversee the process that Theresa May wasn't able to get across the line. And to answer your question as to what I believe his approach will be, I think it's quite clear that he's hell-bent on getting a no-deal Brexit. The EU has made it clear. I mean, they've bent over backwards to negotiate in good faith. They've played some hardball, and you would expect them to. But they've also made it clear they're not going to renegotiate. And Boris, for his part, has made it very clear that, and the people who are backing him, that they will not accept a backstop, that they expect to renegotiate. and that they're not going to budge on that, and that they're more than willing to take a no-deal Brexit, which of course will be catastrophic for the people of the UK and for the UK economy. So what we have here is a group of spoiled brats, basically, who've come by their positions through privilege and by, in Boris's case, meeting the children of the nation's power brokers at places like Eton and Oxford, driving the country over the cliff in the expectation, if we look at it in its finest, in its best light, in the expectation that the UK can somehow throw in with the United States and be treated as an equal partner. And of course, we all know that that's never going to happen. The United States doesn't treat anybody as an equal partner, and certainly will not treat the United Kingdom as an equal partner, because the United Kingdom is not an equal partner. The United Kingdom, if you take away its nukes and its alliance with Europe, and you force the United Kingdom to take the proper place it deserves to have on the world stage, it's just another little island country with a few people that doesn't really make anything. And I think the future for the British people, I think the future for the United Kingdom will be very grim after Brexit. And one would hope that if there's any silver lining in this, it will be that Scotland will be able to secede essentially from the United Kingdom, and that the Irish will be able to at last unify their nation and achieve independence. But it's quite clear, of course, that Boris Johnson, his party, and the British establishment, while they insist that the British people should have autonomy and should have a right to self-determination, they're completely committed to denying that right to the Irish, to the Scottish, to the people of Gibraltar, and anyone else who gets the idea that they don't want to be under the UK's yoke.
Well, that explains a lot, because he also, a while ago, he mentioned that he considers himself as a pure Zionist. And this is just something that will definitely show his approach in the future. But if we truly want to know about the effects of such a claim and such an approach for his foreign policy, what will be the details, or what will be the explanations about it? Ali, can you help us in here?
Well, regardless whether the Prime Minister of Britain is a Zionist or not, or pure Zionist, as Boris Johnson mentioned before, Britain's policy has always been pro-Zionism. They led the Zionist movement in the Middle East. They led to the creation of the Zionist regime back in the day when they were the most powerful empire in the world. Nowadays, as Barry mentioned, that they're not that powerful country anymore. So the Zionist lobby has a lot more influence than they did back then when they were when Britain helped create the Zionist regime in the Middle East. So in terms of their foreign policy, it will be down to the Zionist lobby, what the Zionist lobby in Britain wants, and what the most powerful country in the world wants, which is America. So Britain, like it has been doing for the past few decades, is be the lapdog of the United States and do whatever Israel wants. That's what we have seen in the past, and that's what will continue, regardless of who the Prime Minister is. I mean, we've seen Johnson saying that he is pure Zionist, while at the same time the opposition leader, Corbyn, has not been Labour Party leader, Corbyn, has not been able to remove the, although unjustified, anti-Semitic label that they have given him and the party under his leadership, simply because he supports Palestinian movements. That shows how strong the Zionist lobby is in the United Kingdom, and it shows that Boris Johnson, the showman, is playing right into the Zionist lobby, knowing that they will get him the premiership, which what they did, and he's hoping that he will continue using that connection to the Zionist lobby to maintain this position that he has attained.
As you know, we have the issue of JCPOA, which is going on since a long while, and Iran also somehow waits for the response or for the cooperation of European. So what's your take on this?
Well, look, I think things will deteriorate even further in terms of Iran-UK relations than they already have. I mean, there were some noises coming out of the UK, although I never took them to be anything more than disingenuous, opposing Trump's decision to basically scrap the JCPOA. But what I would say is this, let's not forget that Boris Johnson, you know, even though Donald Trump himself compares Boris Johnson to himself and refers to him as sort of the UK Donald Trump and a clever guy and all the rest of it, Boris Johnson is not anywhere near in the same league as Donald Trump. In fact, if there was an equivalent to Boris Johnson in the United States, it would have to be someone, a sort of version of John Bolton with a sense of humor, I guess, which John Bolton clearly doesn't have. Now, what I'd say about Boris Johnson, certainly my impression of him, is that he's not really an ideologue. So he can call himself a Zionist. I don't really think that means anything in his case, because Boris Johnson is one of those politicians. He doesn't have constituents. He has owners, okay? He's not an ideologue. He's an opportunist. And if you actually look at his position, he's all over the shop ideologically, clearly pro-Israel, because, you know, he's taken the oath, as it were, for his own benefit. He's in favor of the banking sector. He's in favor of, he's voted in favor of reducing taxes essentially for the wealthy in the corporate sector. He's in favor of police powers and mass surveillance. He's opposed any measures proposed to combat climate change. So we get a pretty good picture, although in some areas he identifies as being socially liberal. What I would say is that because of the position taken by his owners, he's one of those guys who clearly embraces a sort of neoliberal economic outlook, while being very neoconservative in terms of his foreign policy outlook. And that's very dangerous, because I think whatever we might say about Donald Trump, it's worth observing that he hasn't led the United States into any new wars as he comes to the end of his first term. And that's not something we could say, for example, about Obama, you know, who by this stage in his administration had wreaked havoc all over the Middle East. Donald Trump hasn't done that yet. To be sure, he's wreaked a lot of havoc, and his sanctions are taking a huge toll in places like Venezuela and Iran and North Korea, but he hasn't sent in the troops like other presidents before him has. And he seems to be somewhat unwilling. He seems to be somewhat committed to making the decision himself rather than being stampeded into it, unlike other people. In fact, the one thing I would say is the reason that the U.S. establishment turned so comprehensively against Donald Trump, even though he embraces pretty much the same policies that both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party embrace, is that because he had the temerity from the outset to see himself as a policy maker rather than a policy taker. And that makes him a loose cannon, somebody who can't be predictably managed. Now, I don't think Boris Johnson is like that. I think Boris Johnson can be managed very easily, can be told what to do, is predictable, and can quite easily be baited into making the decisions that would have to be taken to see the UK get into a military conflict in the Gulf that would in turn see a conflagration, that would see the United States have to get involved, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and everyone else. You know, and of course people have been commenting about this for weeks now, since the UK sort of ramped up their targeting, you know, punching above their weight, their targeting of Iran and Iranian tankers. So I would be very concerned about that. This is a person who I think can be quite easily played and told what to do. Unlike Donald Trump. To be sure, Donald Trump sold out completely, lock, stock, and barrel to the Zionist lobby. He really had no choice because the American establishment completely turned on him, including his own party. But he still is the one who makes the decisions. And I don't think Boris has that kind of a spine in him. I think Boris will do what he's told to do, and I think he'll easily be stampeded. Remember, he's not a person with a great amount of experience on the front bench, okay? In terms of being a part of government on the front bench, he only started in 2016, and as Ali mentioned, he made somewhat of a disaster out of being the foreign secretary. In fact, he barely lasted long enough for us to stop laughing at the fact that he was made foreign secretary. I don't expect anything better from him in terms of his stint as prime minister. I think he's there basically to hold the fort in order to get Brexit across the line without a deal, so that he, along with Theresa May, and even though David Cameron thinks he's going to get away without receiving any blame in the eyes of history, David Cameron as well will carry the blame for driving the UK over the cliff. And once that's done, he'll be gone and there'll be someone else there. And as Ali pointed out, it really ultimately doesn't make much difference, although we do hold out some great hope for the possibility that the current Labour leader might actually be able to rein in his party and take the overwhelming support that he has with the British public to the polls in order to be the next Prime Minister of the UK and then govern the United Kingdom as Prime Minister in a manner that's consistent with what he's been saying for most of his political career. But that remains to be seen. I don't expect Boris Johnson to be around for very long. And in fact, instead of there having been an election within the party by a few tens of thousands of party members to appoint him as prime minister, what should have happened is a general election should have been called. And the people of the United Kingdom should have been able to vote. But of course the Conservatives are the Tories are committed for whatever reason, whether they personally, like Theresa May was opposed to Brexit. So whatever their personal positions were, they're fully committed, fully sold out to the idea of seeing Brexit through. And unfortunately, no politician now, including Corbyn, is in a position to take a contrary position, because the country is so divided over Brexit and there's so much ignorance about the consequences of Brexit that it would be political suicide to take a very clear position going into election. I'm not convinced, though, that Mr. Corbyn, should he be elected in due course, if Brexit hasn't already happened, will be backing Brexit should he be able to set up a government. But that remains to be seen. But I'll leave it at that, I think.
Well, you perfectly about the similarities between, Trump and Boris, and if Boris is gonna follow, Trump's policy in the region. But as you know, there are so many similarities between these two people in many funny ways, though. But I would like to go into the general foreign policy that Boris will especially take specifically on Middle East. So, Ali, do you think Boris will be a second version of Trump concerning Middle East, or would he be someone who totally follows everything that Trump says, or he will take his own kind of approach?
As Barry said, that Boris Johnson is more of a funnier version of John Bolton than a Trump. Trump, as he mentioned, is a conservative president, while Boris Johnson has shown to have very extreme conservative ideas and very extreme liberal ideas at the same time. So we don't, in terms of the character of the person, they might look the same, they might have similar moments where we think it's funny, but That's where the similarities end in terms of whether Johnson will follow Trump's foreign policy in the Middle East or not. That's a given. Since ever since the end of World War II, Britain has been following the United States in every foreign policy action in the Middle East. So that's the way it's going to be. Whether it is a Labour Party leadership or premiership, or whether it is the Conservatives, it's going to be the same. Britain will follow America in this region. We have, I mean, we don't need to go that far, but since the coup against the democratically elected Iranian government back, I can't remember the date now, but during Mossaddeq's reign, was Britain and following the United States lead to overthrow the government. And the same thing in the wars that followed, whether it was aiding Saddam Hussein or invading Iraq or supporting the terrorist groups in the region, supporting Saudi Arabia, arming Mohammed bin Salman to the teeth, helping him in the brutal war against the Yemeni people. It seems Britain just follows the United States as if it is the 51st state of America. That's what we have seen in the past, and it's unlikely to change during Boris Johnson's tenure or any future prime minister for the time being, because as Barry has mentioned before, Britain wants to stay relevant as a power that reminiscent of its past colonialist past, but that's not the case for Britain anymore. So it has to follow a powerful nation that such as the United States in order to stay relevant in this region. It doesn't really have much to say. The foreign policy is acted and decided by the U.S. president, and Britain seems to just follow America wherever they go. That's what we have seen in the past, and that's what we're likely to continue in the near future.
Actually, I have asked all the questions, but I would like to ask you, in case you want to add anything, we would be more than happy to hear it. So,
no, I think we've covered the ground. Now all we can really do is wait and see what happens. Certainly all the signs are very troubling. The cabinet appointed by Boris Johnson is, I mean, they could just as easily be operating out of the Knesset and governing Israel, okay? That's the kind of cabinet he's appointed as the government of the United Kingdom. And this is very troubling that he has, for example, as Home Secretary, an inexperienced loudmouth who was basically forced to resign for compromising national security by going to Israel and reaching effectively a secret deal with the Israelis in order to accommodate an even greater say by the Israelis in politics in the United Kingdom. And there she is now as Home Secretary, and the list, of course, goes on and on and on. But this is a tragic government that he's appointed, but ultimately I don't think it matters. I think Ali's spot on. Remember, the United Kingdom has a prime ministerial system, and even though increasingly we're seeing in countries that have prime ministerial systems that they're inclining to govern almost as presidents, and certainly in the UK that started with New Labour, the fact remains that there's nowhere near as much scope for any individual or any group of individuals to change the course of government policy under a prime ministerial system as there is under a presidential system. So I think what we can look forward to is more of the same, albeit with new risk factors. And of course, the risk factors that are most obvious right now involve the ongoing effort to apparently trigger a conflict in the Gulf with Iran. Apart from that, a lot of the issues that arise out of Boris taking the reins really mostly will affect people in the United Kingdom, and you have to almost sympathize with them. But of course, you know, they've allowed this to happen. My bigger concern really about Brexit is that, you know, it weakens Europe. In fact, arguably it weakens Europe almost to a point where it won't be able to recover. And that, of course, has always been in the interest of the United States. So it's not surprising that we've seen reports of elements from the United States being involved from the start in pushing the Brexit agenda. Because a weak Europe makes for a stronger United States, and that's where my concerns lie when it comes to Brexit.
Thank you, Barry. Ali, can you go ahead?
Whether it's Boris Johnson or Donald as the Prime Minister of Britain and Donald Trump as the President of the United States, is not changing any policies, any great policies for us in the Middle East. So we'll just have to weather another storm that's going to be raging here in the region. As Barry has mentioned, that they are trying to trigger war with Iran, and this is going to be hugely devastating to the whole world, not just the region. So we just hope that this storm that bringing you know, the blonde president and prime minister together, let's hope it doesn't end in a war in this region. That's all we could do, is just wait and hope that nothing catastrophic will happen because of those two.
It is indeed a very informative and brilliant talk with both of you. I'm really thankful to both of you, Ali Musawi from Lebanon and also Barry Grossman from Indonesia. Hereby, I would like to put an end to this episode of The Fact, and I hope we can have you again on the program. For our viewers, you can actually follow our program on the YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again. Goodbye.